I spend a lot of time thinking about the state of our world. Maybe you can relate. I usually sprinkle in a couple existential ruminations about the climate crisis, capitalism, and our general social dysfunction throughout my day, usually during breakfast, while running errands, or just before bed. As I live in Trinidad, when I gaze out the window of the maxi taxis I traverse the roads in, I can't help but notice the pollution, homelessness, and general degradation of infrastructure. Beyond what's right outside the window, I see the deep and destructive roots of patriarchy, racism, capitalist conditioning, and more that sprout normalized abuses and long-standing inequalities. When I hear the news on the radio or the word on the street, the usual concerns of crime, corruption, cost of living, and political apathy rear their heads again and again. When I scroll my feeds, I see similar structural failures internationally. The anarchist in me recognizes that these social and economic issues have systemic explanations, typically stemming from the seed of hierarchy. And when confronted with these issues, as many of you would know, I tend to think and share systemic solutions. I know all too well how hard it is to know where to begin, so I spend some of my time on this channel exploring potential ways of fixing many of our world's woes. Yet in practice, among other obstacles, I face what feels like the cumber of culture. It feels impossible to overcome the hurdle of passivity that seems written into our modus operandi. In fact, instead of examining the systemic sources of our issues, some of my countrymen seem to skip straight to scapegoats in our culture for everything. Every culture has its issues. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, it might be our habitual lateness, authoritarian parenting, or poor customer service. As I speak from a beautiful island yet riddled with issues, I've long recognized that culture always has a role to play, past, present, and future. I've long understood that culture operates in a feedback loop, shaping and being shaped by material conditions. But while I've spent videos discussing library economies, solarpunk solutions, and social revolutions, up until now I hadn't known how to crack culture. But if we want to change the world, I think we'll also have to change our cultures. This project was indeed a journey. Culture is a vast and ephemeral concept that wields immense power in influencing our individual lives and broader social structures. But true to my quest of trying to learn and explore as much as possible, I believe I've come away with a clearer understanding of what cultures are, where they come from, and how they can be shaped to create a better world. Let's start with defining culture itself. Several sciences incorporate culture in their study, but none are as invested in the definition of culture as the beautifully broad field of anthropology, which explores culture as a complex and dynamic concept that encompasses the shared beliefs, values, customs, traditions, behaviors, social norms, and more practiced by a particular group of people that shapes the way they perceive the world, interact with each other, and interpret experiences. Culture is typically acquired through teaching, imitation, and other forms of social transmission, and manifests both materially through technology, architecture, cuisine, and art, and immaterially through social organizations, philosophies, rituals, and practices. You can pause to read, but this iceberg of culture essentially depicts just how deep culture goes. From the surface level practices of fashion, festivals, and food, to the unspoken rules of courtesy and time, to the very concept of self. Put as succinctly as possible, and I'll quote American biologist Peter J. Richerson and anthropologist Robert Boyd's Not by Genes Alone, this iceberg depicts all the ways that culture is socially acquired information that is capable of affecting individuals' behavior. Definitions of culture within anthropology are at least partially influenced by English anthropologist E.B. Tyler's proposed definition back in 1871, though many of his other ideas are quite outdated by today's standards. He defined culture as, quote, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Or, as more contemporarily expressed by Professors Andy Scarry, Liam Mickey, and Paul James in Urban Sustainability in Theory and Practice, culture is how and why we do things around here. The how is how we practice materially, the why emphasizes the meanings, the we refers to the specificity of a life held in common, and around here specifies the spatial and, by implication, the temporal particularity of culture from the local to the global. Cultures are also connected to Irish political scientist Benedict Anderson's concept of nations, in the sense that they too are imagined communities and considered inherently limited, sovereign, and communal. Though more so in the sense of being distinct from other cultures, but not necessarily autonomous in a political sense. Yet despite all these definitions, without even getting into the weeds of whether or not animals are capable of culture, human cultures are already notoriously hard to pin down and clearly delineate. Such difficulties only worsened by the complications introduced by the concepts of race, nationality, and ethnicity, and their confusion in common discourse, so allow my attempt to clarify. Race, very simply, is a social construct. That means it is made real by collective agreement, not objective fact. The concept of race has evolved with time, but the foundation of our modern perception of race was created in the colonial age to justify the subjugation of enslaved African people. Today, race is primarily assigned according to the combination of phenotypical characteristics you receive from your parents, like your hair, skin, eyes, nose, and so on. That combination determines whether you will be perceived by others as white, black, East Asian, Mestizo, East Indian, etc. There's no set amount of racial categories because different parts of the world categorize people differently. Race is entirely superficial and pseudo-scientific, and should be discarded as a means of categorizing people. But that doesn't mean it can be ignored because it still affects people's lives. As for how race relates to the other concepts, your race doesn't determine your culture, nationality, or ethnicity beyond the likelihood that you are born and raised with a particular culture, nationality, or ethnicity. Nationality can refer to either your legal status as a citizen of a country, which does not automatically determine what your culture is, or your identification with a particular nation. A term which in some uses is similar to the concept of ethnicity and can be treated as such, but usually carries more explicitly political intent. When it comes to defining ethnicity, it gets a bit messy. Put simply, doing the YouTuber thing of just borrowing from the Wikipedia article on the subject, an ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other based on perceived shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups, typically including ancestry and culture. Ethnic groups often emphasize one or more specific attributes to define membership. Sikhs and Jews are ethno-religious because they emphasize a shared affiliation with a religious heritage. Austrians and Irish are ethno-national because they emphasize a shared polity in the form of a nation-state. Not all countries are nation-states, so not every nationality is an ethno-national group, but given enough time and effort, the existence of a state can trigger ethnogenesis, aka the formation of an ethnic group tied to that state. French Canadians and Basques are ethno-linguistic because group identity emphasizes a shared language, and they can also be considered ethno-regional as their identities are connected to distinct geographic regions. It goes without saying that in many cases, more than one attribute will define membership with an ethnicity. To quote the article directly, Armenian ethnicity can be defined by Armenian citizenship, having Armenian heritage, native use of the Armenian language, or membership of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Black Americans are an ethno-cultural and ethno-racial group, emphasizing both shared culture and shared physical appearance based on phenotype. Phenotypical attributes are not usually a key determining factor in one's ethnic identity. They can be a stereotypical indication, as seen with the Dinka or Irish, but simply being an extremely tall East African or having red hair does not make someone Dinka or Irish, nor does being black racially make someone Black American. However, because Black American culture is often abbreviated as Black culture, sharing its name with the race of its members, it can confuse some folks who end up thinking that other Afro-diasporic populations are not Black because they're not Black American, or that there is an equivalent white culture. There is no white culture, but there are several distinct predominantly white European cultures, and there are several predominantly white American subcultures and regional cultures. I hope that clears things up. Now let's get back to culture. In Chapter 1 of American anthropologist Clifford Geertz's The Interpretation of Cultures, he talks about how cultural analysis is intrinsically incomplete. And worse than that, the more deeply it goes, the less complete it is. I can imagine that inherent challenge is intensified in an age of globalization, migration, colonization, and intercultural exchange. It seems as though the boundaries are more fluid than ever, overlapping and nesting, as individuals hold multiple cultural identities at once. Geertz goes on to say, there are a number of ways to escape this. Turning culture into folklore and collecting it, turn it into traits and counting it, turn it into institutions and classifying it, turn it into structures and toying with it. But they are escapes. The fact is that to commit oneself to a semiotic concept of culture and an interpretive approach to the study of it is to commit oneself to a view of ethnographic assertion as, to borrow W.B. Galley's by now famous phrase, essentially contestable. Anthropology, or at least interpretive anthropology, is a science whose progress is marked less by perfection of consensus than by refinement of debate. What gets better is the precision with which we vex each other. Perhaps even more vexing is the question of how culture is created. Thankfully, we have some explanations to go off of. For one, we can view cultural development through the lens of evolutionary processes, not in the sense of reducing culture to biology, but in the sense of expanding biology to encompass culture while keeping it distinct. As Richerson and Boyd argued in Not by Genes Alone, culture has propelled human evolution at a trajectory that would be impossible without it. Once our species developed the cognitive prerequisites for culture, like our capacity to learn through imitation, we were well equipped to adapt to our environments at a rate much quicker than the snail's pace of natural selection. You see, on an evolutionary timescale, we are a very young species with very little biological diversity, yet we have tons of cultural diversity. To what extent our biological evolution constrains culture, and vice versa, remains unknown. David Price's Atlas of Ethnographic Studies records over 3,814 distinct cultures having been described by anthropologists. And that's not even all the cultures we have. We probably can't even count them, considering how dynamic and hard to define they can be. Plus, we have over 7,100 languages in the world, and the rate of linguistic change is much slower than the rate of cultural change. So just to know that any number we come up with is probably an underestimation. We know now that our cultural diversity started early, thanks to British anthropologist Robert Foley and Argentinian paleoanthropologist Marta Lahr's study on the evolution of the diversity of cultures. Homo sapiens, that's us, came on the scene in an anatomically modern sense around 300,000 years ago in Africa. During the Middle Stone Age, up to around 50,000 years ago, we already see evidence of regional diversification in culture, with even further diversification carrying us up to 25,000 years ago, both within and outside Africa. Due to some climatic changes that would have fragmented and scattered populations, post 25,000 years ago, cultural regionalization further intensified. And with the end of the Pleistocene nearly 12,000 years ago, warmer conditions brought in even greater diversification. The highly influential American anthropologist Marvin has published several books in the field of cultural studies, particularly on the development of cultural materialism, which is a systems theory influenced by Karl Marx's historical materialism that attempts to account for the origin, maintenance, and change of societies based on two key assumptions. First, that the various parts of society are interrelated. When one part of society changes, other parts must also change. Second, the foundation of a society lies in its environment, which is limited in terms of the amount of energy and raw material it contains and the amount of pollution it can tolerate. That all sounds like common sense, right? In Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, Harris establishes that people will act in ways that make sense according to their social and ecological contexts. He spends much of the book finding materialistic explanations for the Hindu reverence for cows, the Middle Eastern shunning of pigs, and the European disdain for witchcraft, among others, despite other anthropologists suggesting that some of these cultural quirks may be irreducible and inexplicable. A few years later, in Cannibals and Kings, Harris further develops his approach to cultural materialism, with a focus on how population growth and resource pressures influence the development of culture. He looks at the steady adoption of agriculture concurrent with the rise of warfare, the practices of cannibalism and infanticide, and the development of patriarchy, among others, as a culture's response to particular environmental pressures. Thankfully, unlike some theorists, he makes it clear that, quote, nothing I have written in this book supports the view that the individual is helpless before the implacable march of history, or that resignation and despair are appropriate responses to the concentration of industrial managerial power. The determinism that has governed cultural evolution has never been the equivalent of the determinism that governs a closed physical system. Rather, it resembles the causal sequences that account for the evolution of plant and animal species. In other words, just because something is so doesn't mean it was inevitably so or has to continue to be so. Materialist analysis is a useful tool for understanding our circumstances, but we should not confuse it with fatalism. As Marx once wrote, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Harris is considered somewhat of a vulgar materialist today, but even he was able to recognize that we still have the power to change things, once we have developed the consciousness of how things truly are and how they got the way they are. Ultimately, Harris proves 2 points in my mind. One, that we know so little about the people who came long before us and there's only so much we can ever know. And two, while his materialistic explanations are compelling and certainly plausible, that shouldn't be confused with complete certainty. As Harris himself admits, he can't explain everything, nor does he intend to. Once again, Geertz's words ring true. Cultural analysis is intrinsically incomplete. In Not by Genes Alone, Richerson and Boyd attempt to craft a conceptual framework for cultural evolution that mirrors the established framework of genetic evolution to explain the levels of cultural diversity we see across our world today and through history. Unlike genetic evolution, cultural evolution is not limited to vertical transmission between parent and offspring. Its changes can also encompass horizontal and oblique modes of transmission, such as between peers or between teachers and students. Much like genetic evolution involves mutation, drift, and natural selection, cultural evolution might encompass cultural mutation, cultural drift, and cultural selection. Richerson and Boyd break down these concepts a bit differently than I will in Chapter 3 of their book, but for the sake of brevity, I've come up with simpler explanations for each. Cultural mutation involves the small-scale, accidental, or deliberate alteration, modification, introduction, or transmission of cultural elements within a society through innovation, invention, adaptation, or interaction between groups. For example, the introduction of new ingredients may prompt cultural mutation in food habits, such as when edible plants from the Americas were brought over to Afro-Eurasia and vice versa. Cultural drift refers to the gradual, unplanned, and subtle changes that arise and spread within a culture over time due to generational shifts, evolving values, resource distribution, or even seemingly at random, like fashion trends or changes in language. Finally, cultural selection occurs when certain cultural traits, behaviors, ideas, or practices are favored and perpetuated within a society or a group due to factors like their perceived usefulness, relevance to societal needs, ability to solve problems, or even simply because they resonate with individuals on a deep level. The most powerful factor at play in cultural selection tends to be survival pressure, as societies must necessarily adopt certain practices or perish. While our geography, material conditions, and cultural evolution are pieces of the puzzle for sure, we're still missing something. We need an explanation for the differences in behavior we see among people who have long shared histories and environments. Neighbors that have lived in the same region for centuries, yet practice very different traditions and lifestyles. There's one more component of cultural development that I stumbled upon in my research, and I found it in the work of the anthropologist that ignited my interest in the field in the first place. American anthropologist David Graeber and British anthropologist David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything spend some of its time exploring cultural differentiation, otherwise known as schismogenesis, as the source of some of our cultural diversity. English anthropologist Gregory Bateson coined the term schismogenesis back in the 1930s to describe people's tendency to define themselves against one another. Graeber and Wengrow use the example of an argument, where two people may start with minor differences, but over time escalate to adopting extremely polarized positions, even veering towards ideologies they would not typically embrace. Bateson proposed that this phenomenon could be applied within cultures, particularly between men and women, as an explanation for the polarization of the gender binary within many cultures, while Graeber and Wengrow argue that this process could apply between cultures as well, with, quote, English people trying to become as little as possible like the French people as little like Germans, and so on. Take for instance the ancient Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, which simultaneously borrowed from each other while also highlighting their differences. Another example can be found in Chapter 5 of The Dawn of Everything, among the indigenous foraging societies of America's West Coast, where one group's emphasis on male violence contrasted with their neighbors' focus on female knowledge and symbolism. Graeber and Wengrow also draw from the studies of Hungarian-American art historian Esther Pastori, who found schismogenesis in the contrast between Highland Teotihuacan and Lowland Maya art. Quote, Teotihuacan, in Pastori's view, created a new tradition of art to express the ways in which its society was different from that of its contemporaries elsewhere in Mesoamerica. In doing so, it rejected both the specific visual trope of ruler and captive and the glorification of aristocratic individuals in general. In this, it was strikingly different from both the earlier cultural tradition of the Olmec and from contemporary Maya polities. If the visual arts of Teotihuacan celebrated anything, Pastori insisted, then it was the community as a whole and its collective values, which, over a period of some centuries, successfully prevented the emergence of dynastic personality cults. When cultures interact, we can observe two contradictory processes: mutual learning and adoption of ideas, habits, and technologies, while also emphasizing and exaggerating points of difference to distinguish themselves from their neighbors. So now we somewhat understand what culture is, right? It's socially acquired information that is capable of affecting individuals' behavior, the how and why we do things around here. And we understand how culture is created, in response to environmental pressures and material conditions through cultural evolution and schismogenesis. My question is, understanding the profound influence of culture in the ways we think and live, and desiring the development of a culture that is consciously cooperative and resistant to hierarchical power so that we can redirect the course of our declining world, how can we effect culture change? As Marvin Harris establishes in The Rise of Anthropological Theory, social change, which includes culture change, depends on three factors: a society's infrastructure, structure, and superstructure. Put very simply, the infrastructure consists of a society's mode of production and mode of reproduction. The mode of production, as you may recognize from Marxist theory, refers to the economic base of society, which includes the means of production, like factories, land, and technology. The mode of reproduction refers to the demographic factors, like population size and composition, which are crucial in determining the amount and type of resources required from the environment within a society. The structure refers to the social relations of production, or how people interact in the process of producing goods and services, like workers and capitalists, as well as all the other groups, relationships, and organizations of society, like families, political systems, education systems, and other social hierarchies, which are all in part influenced by the underlying economic and material conditions of the infrastructure. Finally, the superstructure, similar to Marx's superstructure, consists of the symbolic, ideological, and cultural aspects of society, including values, ideas, beliefs, and art, which are shaped by the society's underlying infrastructure and structure, and typically used by the ruling class to maintain its dominance and legitimize its control over the means of production. So if we want to effect meaningful change, we have to tackle every level of this framework. We have to reorganize the mode of production and reproduction, reorganize our social relations and structures, and challenge our prevailing ideas, values, and beliefs. The sum total of all those efforts is what social revolution is all about. As I've defined it previously, social revolution is no less than a complete transformation of our society, economy, culture, philosophy, technology, relationships, and politics. I've outlined a more comprehensive approach to social revolution in the past, including the acts of confrontation and non-cooperation necessary to disrupt the current system. But for now, let's take a look specifically at how prefigurative politics and especificismo can play a role in creating social change. Prefigurative politics, or prefiguration, is the deliberate experimental implementation of desired future social relations, institutions, and practices in the here and now. To paraphrase Paul Reichstad and Sofa Shaugredin's book on the subject, prefigurative politics is based on a certain way of thinking about human beings and society that sees the goals of our activities as emerging from our everyday means of doing things. It's the common sense political equivalent of recognizing that, as the Trini saying goes, goat don't make sheep. Your ends are not separate from the means that produce them. If we want to create a society that is based on the self-determination of all the people, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, then we cannot use means that concentrate power in the hands of a few people and disempower the many. We cannot invest in hierarchical social structures and expect egalitarian results. So we need to change our means of doing things, our infrastructure and social structure, to change the ends they produce, which includes our social relations, our individual consciousness, and the collective superstructure. We can effect that change by understanding and manipulating the relationship between powers, drives, and consciousness. Powers refers to your power to, as in your power to do something, not power over others. It's your capacity to do and or to be, like your power to kick a football, or your power to be adequately clothed and sheltered. Your powers are continuously determined by both internal and external factors. Quote, being able to seize the means of production naturally requires you to have certain internal powers of your own, like the capacity to communicate with others and to know how certain machines work. But no matter how great your internal powers are, you also require the right external contexts or conditions, such as an organized anarcho-syndicalist union, a bunch of other workers who are also set on taking over their workplace, a wider political climate in which you're likely to be able to keep control over it, etc. Only once you have the right combination of internal and external powers can you seize control of the means of production. Notice how they specify being part of an anarcho-syndicalist union as being a component of your powers, because your social relations play a crucial role in determining your individual and collective powers, and the structure of organizations and movements impacts the powers that their participants have and develop. A movement structured like an autocratic cult is going to develop a much smaller range of powers within its members than a movement structured like a popular assembly. Turning to drives now, your drives encompass both conscious and unconscious wishes, desires, goals, and motivations. Like powers, drives are influenced by external factors, including natural, social, and historical contexts. Like what you're driven to eat when you're hungry will be determined by time and place. For a British person, that might be beans and toast. For me, it might be doubles, and for an ancient hunter-gatherer, it might be a woolly mammoth. New contexts, new social relations, and new experiences can give rise to new drives. So if you take that same British person and introduce them to some real food and some good weather, they might be driven to stick around instead of returning to their dreary Isle of Origin. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's how colonialism originally kicked off. The relationship between powers and drives is reciprocal. For example, you might have a drive to improve your overall health and fitness, so you start hitting the gym, which results in the development of physical powers such as strength and endurance. And as those powers increase, the drive to maintain good health is reinforced. Understanding how drives and powers reinforce each other is essential for prefigurative politics. You need to develop both the powers to understand and construct free and equal social relations, and the drive to implement and enhance them. Finally, our consciousness allows reflection, deliberation, and the ability to direct and modify actions. Our consciousness is also contextual, shaped by natural, social, and historical factors, and impacts our powers and drives by aiding the development of tools and concepts. Tools, such as bows and arrows and number systems, enhance our powers, like our power to hunt or our power to quantify the world around us, while concepts influence drives. Developing the concept of sexual harassment was able to drive more people to identify and eliminate certain actions and behaviors. These products of our consciousness continuously influence and shape society. Developing and distributing radical theory in particular plays a key role in developing our consciousness to critique societal norms, understand social dynamics, envision alternative social organizations, and organize for change. The powers, drives, and consciousness that people develop are used to either maintain a given social system, change it, abolish it, or replace it altogether. So if you want to create an egalitarian society with an egalitarian culture, you need to focus your organizing efforts on developing people's ability to collectively self-organize in every aspect of life, which will drive them to seek out and develop horizontal forms of organization as opposed to other forms of organization, which will shape their consciousness about power relations within their society and equip them with the capacity to resist the rise of domination in the future. Whereas if you wanted to create a hierarchical society with a culture of domination, you would remove people's ability to self-organize through the legal system, the education system, the property system, the political system, and so on, creating a dependent populace with no drive for self-management and no consciousness of how they might be free from such an all-encompassing system of domination. Makes sense, right? So how do you put this concept into action? Well, especifismo is an organizational strategy that you can draw from if you're looking for a practical way to influence social change. I've done a video about it before, but in summary, especifismo emphasizes 1. The need for specifically anarchist organization built around a unity of ideas and praxis. 2. The use of the specifically anarchist organization to theorize and develop strategic political and organizing work. And 3. active involvement in and building of autonomous and popular social movements through the process of social insertion. That last part matters most here. Social insertion is the practice of engaging with non-anarchist groups, organizations, and communities to foster horizontal relationships, encourage self-organization, and empower those within them to resist hierarchical forms of organization. So you don't necessarily need to start your own anarchist social movement from scratch. You can try to implement a specific tactics in the organizations that are already active, pushing them towards greater degrees of self-organization through practices like consensus, building up their drive for bottom-up directed social change through direct action, and enhancing their revolutionary consciousness through anarchic theory. I know that social change is not easy. Although I feel like I understand culture much better now than I did before, and have a better sense of what it takes to shape them, I still don't have all the answers yet. I continue to draw inspiration from the still living, consciously egalitarian indigenous cultures of our world, like the Mbuti of the Congo, the Tayal people of the Smangas community in Taiwan, and the Zapatistas of Chiapas, Mexico. I believe they all have lessons to teach us, and as I continue to learn and explore as much as possible, I can only hope that our world's beautiful mosaic of cultures endures. All power to all the people. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with fellow peoples. Thanks to the seedlings, the saplings, and especially the roots for making all this possible, including our newest members, Tara, Victor Vidal, Master Chef Harrison, and Maria Geertz. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/sayingtrue. Check out my other videos for a range of radical topics. Thanks again. Peace.